You, Me, and Beyond, Episode 1, The Housewife Who Filmed the Light, the Dorothy Izatt case hosted by J-Lab. It's November 9th, 1974, Vancouver, British Columbia. A woman named Dorothy Izatt is standing in her kitchen doing what she does most evenings, which is making dinner. Nothing about this night is supposed to be different from any other night. And then it is. She gets a feeling, the kind most of us have had at some point, usually followed by nothing. The feeling of being watched. She looks up out the window, and hanging in the sky over her house is something she can't explain, a diamond-shaped object, glowing, just sitting there. Dorothy Izatt doesn't know it yet, but this is the beginning of almost 30 years of her life. By the time it's over, she'll have shot more than 30,000 feet of film. She'll be tested by one of the most respected UFO investigators in American scientific history, and she'll become, depending entirely on who you ask, either one of the most quietly compelling witnesses in the history of this subject, or a case study in how an ordinary camera can fool an ordinary person over and over for decades. I want to be upfront about something before we get into it. This show isn't going to tell you what to believe. I'm going to give you what's actually documented, who investigated it, the strongest arguments against it, and where the honest answer is simply, we don't know. What you do with that is up to you. Welcome to You, Me, and Beyond. Let's start with who she actually was, because that matters more than it sounds like it should. Dorothy Izatt was born September 24th, 1922, in Kowloon, Hong Kong. She eventually married a man named Duncan Izatt, and she settled into a life that, by every account we have, was completely unremarkable, in the best sense of that word. Nearly every article written about her uses some version of the same phrase: mild-mannered Vancouver housewife, not a researcher, not someone who'd spent years around fringe science, not someone chasing a book deal or a following. That detail, ordinary person, no prior interest in the subject, is actually one of the load-bearing pillars of why this case gets taken seriously at all. If Dorothy Izatt had spent the 1960s going to UFO conventions, her 1974 sighting would be a footnote. Instead, she was someone with zero track record in this world who suddenly had an experience she didn't ask for, and by most accounts didn't particularly want. Here's what I find most telling about what happened next. Her first instinct wasn't to call a newspaper, it was to try to talk to it. She grabbed a flashlight, just a regular household flashlight, went outside and started signaling the object. And she said something happened she wasn't expecting. The object seemed to respond. When she moved the beam, she said the light in the sky moved with it. Hold on to that detail because we're coming back to it later when we get into the actual physical explanations for what might be on her film. Her family didn't take this seriously at first. Neither did most of the people she initially told. And this is the part of her story that I think explains everything that came after. The ridicule is what pushed her toward documentation. Her logic was simple. If nobody believes me, I need proof. So an ordinary Vancouver housewife with no photography background anyone has documented picked up an 8mm home movie camera and taught herself how to use it to point at the night sky. That's the whole origin story. No government conspiracy, no cult, no prior fascination with aliens. Just a woman who saw something, wasn't believed, and bought a camera. So what did she actually film? Because she filmed UFOs for 30 years is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and I want to slow down and be specific because the specifics are stranger and honestly more ambiguous than the headline version of this story usually lets on. Between 1974 and the early 2000s, Dorothy shot more than 30,000 feet of film. Some estimates put it at roughly 350 individual short films by the mid-1990s, almost all of it taken from her own porch and backyard, using a series of different 8mm cameras over the years. What's on it generally is not flying saucers with windows and landing gear. It's lights, balls of light, moving in loose formation across the frame, streaks, sudden bright flashes that blow out sections of the film, diffuse glowing shapes that don't resolve into anything with a hard edge. Here's the detail that made her case different from 1,000 other I saw a light in the sky reports. When Dorothy sat down with a home viewer and went through her film frame by frame, inching it back and forth by hand, she noticed something in the overexposed flash frames. Instead of just being blown out white nothing, There were fine lines and streaks running through them, moving in different directions. She came to believe these lines were a form of communication, that whatever was out there was, in some sense, trying to talk to her through the film itself. She gave these things a name of her own, not UFOs, not extraterrestrials. She called them beings of light. In her own account, these weren't nuts and bolts spacecraft piloted by little green men. She described them as conscious entities, visiting her, and in her telling, teaching her, communicating telepathically rather than through any conventional means. There's one anecdote from a documentary crew that belongs in this episode, because it's genuinely eerie, whatever you make of the rest of the case. During filming for a 2008 documentary about her called Capturing the Light, the crew was interviewing Dorothy's daughter inside the house. Nobody in the room saw anything unusual happen. But when they reviewed the footage afterward, there's a moment where a red light appears in the window behind her, moves rapidly to one side, and stops, revealing what looks like some kind of luminous object hovering silently in the night sky behind her shoulder. Not one person in that room noticed it happening in real time. It only exists on the tape. I want to be really clear about something here, because it's easy to get carried away in a segment like this. None of what I just described is independently, physically verified footage of an extraterrestrial craft. It's home movie footage, shot on consumer-grade film, of lights and streaks that Dorothy Izatt, and later some investigators, interpreted as intentional and intelligent. Whether that interpretation holds up is exactly what the rest of this episode is about. If Dorothy Izatt's story ended with Housewife films weird lights, believes they're aliens, we probably wouldn't be doing an episode about her. Backyard UFO footage is not exactly rare. What makes her case different is one name, J. Allen Hynek. Hynek was an astrophysicist at Northwestern University who spent decades as the scientific consultant to the U.S. Air Force's official UFO investigation programs, Project Sign, Project Grudge, and most famously, Project Blue Book. He's the person who came up with the classification system you've probably heard even if you didn't know where it came from, close encounters of the first, second, and third kind. Steven Spielberg borrowed that phrase directly from Hynek's own vocabulary for his 1977 film. Hynek started his career as essentially the government's designated skeptic. His job was largely to explain sightings away, but over the decades, his public position shifted. He became convinced that while the vast majority of UFO reports had mundane explanations, there was a real residue of cases that didn't, and that this residue deserved serious scientific attention rather than automatic dismissal. Hynek personally investigated Dorothy Izatt's case, and what he did next is the single strongest piece of evidence in her entire file. He didn't just look at her existing footage and take her word for it. He designed a control test. He gave her 3 separate cameras and had her film the same phenomena simultaneously with all 3 at once. When the film came back, according to accounts of the test, the same objects and the same strange streaking effects showed up on all 3 cameras at the same time. Sit with that for a second, because it's the crux of the compelling side of this case. If you're trying to explain this away as one faulty camera, a scratched lens, a light leak, a personal quirk in how she was shooting, a 3-camera simultaneous match is a much harder thing to wave off. It doesn't prove extraterrestrial contact, but it does argue against the simplest explanation, which is that this is just an artifact of one specific piece of equipment. It's also worth telling you what Hynek actually thought was going on, because it's not the little green men explanation you might expect. Hynek, working alongside another major figure in this field, the scientist and writer Jacques Vallée, had by this point in his career moved toward a theory that UFO phenomena might not be visitors from other planets at all, but something closer to visitors from another dimension, beings whose physics simply don't match ours. Applied to Izatt's footage specifically, the theory went that the strange bursts of light on her film might represent something like a passage or a doorway briefly opening between our world and wherever these beings exist. I want to flag something here because it's a good piece of intellectual honesty to build into this. Hynek's authority is real. He was a legitimate, credentialed scientist with decades of institutional experience investigating this exact subject. But his framework was already unconventional by the time he looked at Izatt's film. He wasn't a blank slate skeptic who got converted by her footage alone. He came to her case already inclined to interpret ambiguous phenomena as evidence for his interdimensional theory. That doesn't invalidate the multi-camera test. That's a genuinely interesting empirical result regardless of anyone's theory. But it's worth separating. Hynek ran a control test and got a striking result. From Hynek endorsed her interpretation of what the result meant. Those are two different claims. Now let's steelman the other side, because this is where the story gets, I think, genuinely more interesting than a simple true or false. There's a detail buried in the coverage of Dorothy's case that I think is the single most important skeptical data point in the whole file, and it doesn't get anywhere near as much attention as the Hynek test. At some point, a television crew working on a segment about her asked her to do something slightly different. Film ordinary things, everyday scenery, her own grandchildren, using the exact same camera she used for her sky footage. When that film came back, it also had flashes of light on it. Now, here's the important nuance, because I don't want to overstate this either. Those flash frames on the control footage of mundane subjects were reportedly fully overexposed white blowouts, without the fine internal detail, the lines and streaks that she found so compelling in her actual sighting footage. So this isn't a slam dunk. Gotcha. It's always been nothing. But it does tell us something important. Whatever is producing flash artifacts on Dorothy's film happens even when she's not pointing the camera at anything unusual. Her camera and her technique reliably produce anomalous flashes. That's a foundational fact any serious investigation has to grapple with. So, what's the actual physical mechanism that might produce this? A few candidates, and they're all boring, which is sort of the point of skeptical explanations. First, flash and particulate reflection. Picture this. You're outside at night, minimal ambient light, and you fire a camera flash at full intensity with the lens focused for distance, rather than for whatever's actually close to the lens. That flash can illuminate nearby moisture in the air, or dust, or tiny airborne particles right in front of the camera, and bounce back as blurry, glowing reflections on the film. From a distance, on projected footage, those reflections can look exactly like floating orbs of light hanging in the sky above a landscape, when in reality they were never more than a few inches from the lens. Second, garden variety lens flare. This is such a well-understood phenomenon in photography that there's an entire body of engineering literature about how to computationally remove it from digital images. Anytime a strong light source, a street light, a car headlight, an aircraft's navigation light, even the moon, hits a lens at the wrong angle, the internal glass elements inside the lens scatter and reflect a fraction of that light along unintended paths. That produces exactly the kind of streaks, ghosting, and orb-shaped artifacts that show up throughout Izatt's footage. Under normal daylight conditions, these artifacts are usually invisible, but at night, with a single bright point source in an otherwise dark frame, they become dramatically more visible and dramatically easier to misread as an object rather than an artifact of the lens itself. Third, and this is a research hygiene point worth mentioning directly, not really a claim about Dorothy's own footage. Be careful about what circulates online under her name. In the comment threads on articles about her case, there's a documented instance where a widely shared video claimed to be Izatt's footage was actually shot by an entirely different person near the Black Sea in Turkey during the well-known Kumburgaz UFO sightings of 2007 to 2009, years after Dorothy would have been in her 80s and largely out of the public eye. This is an extremely common problem in this subject generally. Footage gets stripped of context, recaptioned, and passed around, and by the time it reaches you, it's wearing somebody else's name. So where does that leave us? A fair, balanced read of the skeptical case is roughly this. We have a well-documented, physically plausible, and completely mundane mechanism, flash on particulate reflection combined with ordinary lens flare that can account for orbs, streaks, and flashes on analog film shot at night. We also have direct evidence that Dorothy's own equipment produced flash artifacts even when filming known, ordinary subjects. That's a strong case for most, if not all, of this footage being an artifact of amateur night photography, not evidence of anything unusual in the sky. The thing that keeps this case from being fully closed, even for a skeptic, is the multi-camera simultaneity result from the Hynek test, which, if accurately reported, isn't something lens flare alone obviously explains, since 3 separate lenses shouldn't produce identical artifacts from independent reflections in perfect sync. Let's zoom out for a minute because I think this is where the Izatt case becomes useful for something bigger than just one woman's story. It's basically a 50-year-old preview of the exact same evidentiary argument we're having right now at a government level with vastly better equipment. Since 2022, the Pentagon has had a dedicated office for this. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO, set up specifically to receive and investigate reports of what the government now calls unidentified anomalous phenomena, or UAP, from military pilots, sailors, and other personnel. The scale here is genuinely large. In its most recent full reporting period, AARO received 757 new reports, bringing its total case inventory to over 1,600 as of late 2024. And crucially, this isn't backyard consumer film anymore. This is instrumentation from actual military-grade sensor platforms, including electro-optical and infrared systems designed for threat detection, not ghost hunting. Here's the part that should sound familiar after everything we just talked about with Dorothy's camera. Even that equipment produces its own artifacts. AARO's own reporting explicitly notes that sensor glare can distort the apparent pixelation and shape of an object on infrared footage, which is, functionally, the exact same category of problem as lens flare on Dorothy's 8mm film, just with vastly more expensive optics. The technology has changed enormously in 50 years. The underlying evidentiary problem, is this a real object or an artifact of how the camera is seeing it, has not changed at all. And the resolution numbers tell a familiar story too. Of the most recent batch of cases, dozens were resolved outright as balloons, birds, or drones. Hundreds more were resolved to other mundane explanations. A very large chunk, over 400 cases, simply lacked enough data to analyze it all, which, if you think about it, is basically the institutional grade version of the footage isn't good enough to say anything definitive, which is exactly the position skeptics put Dorothy's film in. But, and this is important for balance, it doesn't all resolve to nothing. 21 cases from that reporting period were specifically flagged by AARO as meriting further analysis due to anomalous characteristics or behavior that the office couldn't currently explain. The Pentagon's own public statement on this is precise and worth getting exactly right. Despite that residue of unexplained cases, the Department of Defense has said it has found no verifiable evidence of extraterrestrial beings, activity, or technology. There's one more layer here that's honestly a great plot twist, and it complicates the government is hiding it narrative in an interesting direction. A 2024 AARO historical review reportedly found that a significant number of classic UFO legends, the kind of Cold War-era stories that shaped decades of public belief, actually trace back to the U.S. military itself deliberately stoking those stories as cover for concealing real, but entirely terrestrial, advanced weapons programs during periods of geopolitical tension. So some of the evidence fueling UFO belief for the last 70 years wasn't misperception at all. It was intentional government misdirection, just not the kind most UFO believers assume. Put Dorothy Izatt next to that, and here's the interesting comparison. Her case has zero indication of any institutional agenda. She wasn't part of a psyop, wasn't near a classified test site as far as we know, had nothing to gain, which either makes her a purer, more credible witness than a lot of Cold War-era UFO lore, or it just means her footage is explainable by ordinary means because there's no cover story required to explain an amateur photographer's lens flare. So let's land the plane. If you asked me point blank, after all of that, okay, but what's actually true? Here's the honest answer. What we can say with real confidence, no footage from Dorothy Izatt's archive and no case in the entire modern AARO inventory has produced peer-reviewed, independently replicated physical evidence establishing a non-terrestrial origin for anything on film. That's not a matter of opinion. It's the Pentagon's own stated conclusion, and it's consistent with the general scientific consensus. What we can also say with confidence: the mundane explanations on offer, lens flare, flash on particulate reflection, sensor artifacts, misidentified aircraft and satellites are real, well-documented, physically understood phenomena that account for the overwhelming majority of anomalous-looking footage in both amateur and military contexts. What remains genuinely, honestly unresolved, and I think this is the most useful note to end on, is the multi-camera simultaneity result from Hynek's test on Dorothy's footage. As far as the available record shows, that specific result hasn't been independently reproduced or re-examined using modern forensic image analysis. It's not confirmed. It's not debunked. It's just sitting there, 50 years old, unresolved, pretty much exactly like AARO's own list of 21 anomalous cases sitting in a filing cabinet in Washington right now. That, honestly, might be the most useful thing this case can teach us. The line between explained and unexplained isn't usually a dramatic revelation. It's normally just a lack of follow-up. Nobody ran the multi-camera test on Dorothy Izatt's footage a second time. Nobody's rescanned her original 8mm reels with modern digital forensics. The mystery isn't necessarily that something impossible happened in her backyard. It's that nobody with the right tools ever finished checking. Dorothy Izatt died in January of 2021 in Abbotsford, British Columbia, having spent close to 50 years of her life pointing a camera at her own night sky. Whatever was or wasn't up there, she never stopped looking. And in a strange way, that might be the most human part of this whole story. Not the lights, not the theories, but one very ordinary woman refusing to look away from something she couldn't explain for the rest of her life. That's the Dorothy Izatt case. If you want primary material to check any of this yourself, start with the 2008 documentary Capturing the Light and Peter Gutilla's book, Contact with Beings of Light, published in 2003. Next time, we're staying in almost exactly the same era, but heading south to a man who believed the sky itself was alive. Not with alien pilots, with actual living creatures. Trevor James Constable spent years photographing what he called critters, invisible, amoeba-like organisms he believed were swimming through Earth's atmosphere. It's stranger than it sounds, and it might explain more or less than you'd think. Thanks for listening to You, Me, and Beyond. I'm J Lab, and I'll see you next time.